Jen, please go ahead.
Hello, and welcome to the second APLD webinar of 2014. Special thanks to our Education Committee, Robert Kazam, Webinar Committee Chair, and Vanessa Gardner-Nagel, Communications Outreach Chair, for the coordination of today's webinar. We'd also like to thank APLD's exclusive platinum sponsor, Monrovia, for their support of the organization, and also recognize our gold, silver, and bronze sponsors. Gold sponsors are Bartlett Tree Experts, Dynascape Software, Genesis 3 Incorporated, and Nemetschek Vectorworks. Silver sponsors are the Davey Tree Expert Company and Proven Winners. And our bronze sponsors are FX Luminaire, Portica Insurance and Employee Benefits, and Garden Design Magazine. Please support our sponsors as they allow us to bring programs like this one to you at a very reasonable cost. If you didn't already read the webinar housekeeping items, please note the following. If you have difficulties hearing or viewing the webinar, please call the APLD office at 717-238-9780. To ask a question of the speaker at any time, please click the speech bubble, type the question into the chat box that appears, and then click send or press the enter key. Gary will answer questions as we go along through the webinar. For today's webinar, we are trying a new way to enhance the Q&A portion. We will have an interactive time at the end of the webinar, and at the end of this hour, you will receive additional instructions on how to participate in this interactive session. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Gary Smith. As one of North America's leading landscape designers, Gary specializes in botanical gardens and arboretums, as well as public art installations and private gardens, often weaving together local ecological and cultural themes. Gary lectures frequently, including the annual meetings of the American Public Garden Association, the Association of Professional Landscape Designers, and the American Society of Landscape Architects. He serves on the ASLA Education Advisory Committee and developed an ASLA Professional Practice Network on Planning Design. Formerly an associate professor of landscape design at the University of Delaware, he has also served on the faculties of the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Texas, and Louisiana State University. Gary is the author of From Art to Landscape, Unleashing Creativity in Garden Design. Please note that the names of all those registered for today's webinar will be put into a drawing to receive a copy of Gary's book for Timber Press, and we thank Timber Press for their donation. Please welcome Gary.
Thank you, Jen. It's great to be here, and thanks everybody for participating in this webinar. I'm really happy to bring you this talk on nature's patterns in art and design. That's a Catinus, by the way, that's in my backyard in my home in Toronto. I live in both Toronto and New York City now, so it's interesting going back and forth. I see from the list of folks that are signed up for the webinar that we've got a pretty good cross-section across the U.S., so welcome to everybody from all the different parts of the country. This is great. What we're going to do is talk about patterns in nature and in the world around you, and then I'm going to sort of weave into that discussion, I guess, some examples of how patterns can be used in art and design, and then show a few projects that I've worked on toward the end of the presentation. And as Jen said, I'm looking forward to having some discussion at the end. But please, post questions as we go along, and we can keep it pretty informal. So just feel free to chime in. I want to say, sort of by further introduction, I grew up in Delaware, near Longwood Gardens, and I'm sure many of you have been to Longwood over the years. And when I was in high school, and back in the 70s, Longwood was free. They didn't charge admission back then, and we could skip school and get up to Longwood and hang out in the gardens. And so that was, growing up in that part of the country, in the Philadelphia area, there were so many public gardens all over the place, but just growing up with gardens was a part of my upbringing, studying horticulture in high school and art, and then visiting gardens. I studied at the University of Pennsylvania in graduate school, and also as an undergrad at the University of Delaware, studied landscape design, and met some pretty interesting people. Roberto Burle Marx, for example, this is one of his projects in Brazil. And my professor at the university, Conrad Hammerman, was Burle Marx's associate in the U.S., and so he would bring him up. He brought him up a couple of times during the time we were at the University of Delaware, and interacted with Roberto. I didn't really know as an undergrad that he was such a significant figure in landscape architecture, but of course in the 20th century there probably was no greater landscape architect than Roberto Burle Marx. I'm getting a question, what are those purple plants? And I'm afraid I can't answer that one. They're in Brazil, so I wish I knew. But Roberto Burle Marx was mostly known for his work in abstract design. He was a painter, an opera singer, worked in all different kinds of arts, but he was mostly an abstract designer, and these really bold forms, these bold lines that swept across the landscape were really powerful, and you knew that you were in a landscape designed by an artist. But another teacher of mine was A.E. Bai, a Connecticut landscape architect, and I got to know him at the University of Delaware, and at the University of Pennsylvania. And A.E. Bai's sort of greatest compliment was if somebody looked at a landscape that he had designed and said, well, which part did you do? Because he was really imitating nature, and he really wanted the mark of the human hand to be invisible. And so he was interested in all the diversity and complexity that's in a natural garden. And he photographed his work in black and white because he really was interested in the subtleties of the landscape. So those two very extreme points of view, from Roberto and his bold colors and abstract forms to Mr. Bai and his real subtle use of texture, those were two big influences on me as when I was studying landscape design. Here's Conrad Hammerman, my teacher from the University of Delaware and Burle Marx's sort of representative in the U.S. In his garden in West Philadelphia. This is just a couple of years ago. Conrad is now 92. I'm going to be visiting with him on Saturday. I still get to take the train down to Philly and see him from time to time. But he studied landscape architecture with Roberto Burle Marx in Brazil and really was trained from the beginning as an abstract designer. And Burle Marx would bring a bouquet of flowers into the studio in the morning and put them on the table and say to Conrad, okay, now make an abstract painting of that. And he would, and then Burle Marx would come and a few days later and give a critique and say, well, that's really a good distillation of that bouquet of flowers, but let's take it one step further and make it even more abstract. And so he would do a painting like this, taking the vocabulary that was in that bouquet and really turning it into a very clean work of abstract design. I mean, let me just back up and look at that. There's the bouquet of flowers, and you can see those triangular forms, those intersecting lines. You can also see some curving forms in the fruits down there on the table. And then you look at the painting and you see how these angles and lines are accentuated, but there's still some of the curving forms in there as well. In Conrad's own garden, his design took that vocabulary of the angular lines, and, let's go back to the painting and see that. And you can see the triangles and the trapezoids and so on. And he put that into the design plan for his garden. But also you can see along the top edge there a fence that he designed for the garden as well. Here's Conrad a couple of years ago in his studio, in his home, on the second floor of his home in West Philadelphia. And you can see outside his window a bit of that fence. So here he is looking at the plan, and then the garden is outside the window. And when you look out the window and down into the garden, it's sort of a plan view, but one of the things I love about this image is the way the lines in the fence just move right down into the garden and through the garden. So there's this wonderful union between the horizontal elements and the vertical elements. So it really is a work of abstract art. So that's kind of where I came from as a designer. Now, for about the last 15 or 20 years, I've been collecting images of patterns in nature, patterns in art, patterns in advertising, in the world around us. I was giving a lecture about 15 years ago about patterns, and I started to assemble all of these images and looked at them and was kind of surprised to discover that there are only 8 of them. So this is not a very complicated way of looking at the world. The universe has 8 patterns in it, and we're going to look at each of them independently and then see how they're woven together in the landscape. So the scattered pattern, the fractured, mosaic, naturalistic drift, serpentine, spiral, radial, dendritic. Once you start to look at the world in this kind of simplified way with these 8 patterns and develop a vocabulary for how to look at what's going on around you, I think it becomes really interesting, and it facilitates your own work as an abstract designer. So starting with the scattered pattern, one of my mentors and teachers from the University of Pennsylvania days was Carol Franklin, who was one of the founding partners of Andrew Pogon Associates in Philadelphia. She was a big fan of the scattered pattern, and she liked to call it clumps and gaps. This is bunchberry, native dogwood in Maine, growing on the forest floor, and you can see those flowers. Some are clustered together in these, dense little clumps, and then there are gaps in between. So the clumps have 2, 3, 8, 12 elements in them, and then the gaps have various sizes of spaces in them, and you start to see these in all over the place. And there's always a process of some kind, some sort of natural process that leads to these patterns evolving. This is hardy orange, Poncirus at Longwood Gardens, on the mulch under the shrub. This is just gravity pulling these fruits off the plant and depositing them on the forest floor, and you can see the clumps and gaps. And a native gourd in northern New Mexico outside of Santa Fe. There's always a process. Here the seed sprouts, the gourd sends its stems across the ground. There are flowers that are sort of regularly spaced along the stems. Some of them get pollinated, some of them don't. Some of those go on to develop in the fruits. In the winter, the leaves die away, and you've got that clump and gap pattern. I was at Epcot a number of years ago, and they were stringing lights up into the trees. And the people doing that work had just laid these strings of lights down on the lawn to make it easy to pick them up and put them in the trees. Now, on each of these electrical cords, the lights are spaced perfectly uniformly along that cord. But they really weren't thinking about that when they laid them down. They kind of laid them down randomly. And what evolved was the clump and gap scattered pattern. So we can have our best efforts to make things line up perfectly, but I think, as you all know, over time, nature will do what it can do to kind of make that pattern more organic. And we see that pattern all over the place, just in the way flowers arrange themselves in the landscape. The fractured pattern comes from a material of some sort of uniform material laid across the surface that has a uniform force or pressure applied to it. And this is mud. So it's just a simple layer of mud. The sun beats down on the mud perfectly uniformly. As the mud dries, it shrinks and it cracks into this fractured pattern. You see that in tree bark as well. Some trees more pronounced than others. These are 2 trees at the Birmingham Botanical Garden in Alabama. On the left is a persimmon, and on the right a red pine. There's a simple uniform skin of bark around the circumference of the tree. As the tree grows, the trunk gets thicker and thicker. There's a perfectly uniform pressure being pressed outward from the interior of the trunk, and the bark splits and evolves into this fractured pattern. This is a synthetic polymer, 1 micron thick, pressed between 2 glass slides. apply the pressure, and then crack. The scattered or the fractured pattern occurs. There's also a bit of a dendritic pattern, and we'll talk about that a little later on. You can see at the bottom of this image there was probably a little more pressure applied at one edge of the slide, so the cracking moved from the bottom of the slide up and radiating outward. But we'll talk more about dendritic in a moment. At the new park in Orange County that's designed by Ken Smith and others, this was on a former Marine base, and they took pieces of the runway of the old in the old Marine base and recycled the concrete and used it for slope stabilization. So these are 8 to 10 inch thick chunks of concrete laid up against the slope in a fractured pattern. Some fracturing of just the edge of an asphalt walkway, and then taking that pattern and thinking of using that in a design landscape with these concrete pavers. At Callaway Gardens in Georgia, in Pine Mountain, Georgia, I was asked to design their Mediterranean house. This is a conservatory garden. And we used recycled concrete as well, along with recycled stone from an earlier design in that conservatory to create these places for growing Mediterranean plants. And because a lot of plants from the Mediterranean region are very spiky and sharp, I thought doing a stone pattern that was spiky and sharp would be a good way to go. This was a conservatory that had been full of chrysanthemums and rhododendrons and sort of your basic conservatory mix. And they wanted to do something really new that would invite a new audience to Callaway Gardens. And I was standing up there where those two young garden visitors are standing, taking photographs, and I heard the doors open. Some people walked in, and it was an elderly couple. I guess they were a husband and wife, and they didn't see me, and I heard the wife exclaim to her husband. She said, "This is ugly." I laughed, and they looked up at me, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry." I said, "No, it's fine. You're like, it's no problem." And then the next day I was in there photographing, and these two young people came in. I said, "What do you think of this?" And they said, "We love it. We were here last week, and we liked it so much we joined the garden, and now we come back all the time." So using some of these patterns in a dramatic way, I think, is a way to attract a younger audience into your work. The mosaic pattern is when you take a couple of different scattered patterns and superimpose them over each other. This is a wetland in Delaware, and clumps and gaps. So the clumps of one plant and then the gaps in between, and then those gaps are filled by clumps of another species. Lichens growing on a rock in coastal Maine. And here there's actually a combination of a mosaic pattern and the fractured pattern as well. You can see how the sun has caused those lichens to fracture. And the mosaic, of course, is a wonderful pattern to use in perennial gardens. This is at the Denver Botanical Garden in their Waterwise garden. And if you simplify the plant palette to just a few species, you can really make some strong mosaic patterns. If you get too many different things going on at once, the pattern is more difficult to see. This one it looks like a Jackson Pollock painting, but it's not. It's actually in the subway in London, and it was a concrete wall that they had advertising posters on, and every several weeks they would rip down one poster and put the glue back up and put up another one, and then after a while they'd rip that one down. And what happened over time is that this pattern, this mosaic pattern of shards of different pieces of advertising would kind of build up, and I thought it really did look like an abstract painting. Another mosaic pattern, the process here that created this mosaic was weathering. This was a dumpster out in my neighborhood up in Toronto. They were remodeling a house down the street, and this had been painted, and then the sun and the weather eroded the paint, and they put another coat of paint on, and then over time this really beautiful mosaic pattern evolved. And, not unlike the paintings of Monet. I mean, he was one of the great masters of looking at patterns in nature and the mosaic and creating large paintings from studying those patterns. At Millennium Park in Chicago, the Lurie Garden, designed by Pete Udoff, horticulturist, with Catherine Gustafson, the landscape architect. It's a wonderful mosaic of meadow plants growing on top of a parking garage. And here back at the Denver Botanical Gardens. At a friend's garden outside of Wilmington, Mary Shea is her name, and she loves experimenting with new cultivars of plants. And these are very small-scale mosaics that I think are just really fun to look at. So even at the very small scale, you can recreate these mosaic patterns. And here at the Santa Fe Botanical Garden, I've been working on the Santa Fe Botanical Garden for about 7 years now. And we opened Phase 1 to the public in July last year, and we're blessed with a lot of rain in July and August. And so by September, we had quite a mosaic going on in the perennial borders. Naturalistic drift. Now, if you imagine the scattered pattern, okay, take a handful of marbles and kind of throw it up in the air and let it fall down onto the carpet, and a scattered pattern will evolve. You'll get some marbles clumping together, and then there'll be gaps in between. But if you take that handful of marbles and kind of toss it to the side, most of them will be pretty close to you, and some of them will be far away. And as you get farther and farther away from you, they get further and further spaced apart. And a lot of native plants in the landscape end up having that kind of spacing, this naturalistic drift, particularly plants that are dispersed through the landscape by birds. So here, for example, are bayberry and red cedars growing in New England. And, you know, a group of cedar waxwing will land on one of these red cedars, and they'll gorge themselves on all the berries. And then before they take off to fly to the next cedar, you know, the digestive system of a cedar waxwing works really quickly to separate the pulp of the seed from the seed. So they want to jettison the seed to lighten their weight when they go to take off and fly. So as they take off from the cedar, they squirt out the seed with a little packet of fertilizer wrapped around it, and then the seed hits the ground, and that's where a new cedar can sprout and grow. So that's what causes the naturalistic drift pattern in with that particular species. But in the desert Southwest, this is in New Mexico, these native agaves are also using the naturalistic drift pattern. You can see a small clump in the foreground and then another one drifted into the middle distance. Here, these are plants that spread by stolons, by underground stems. So the stolon is moving along just beneath the ground surface until it finds just the right spot to sprout a new plant. So there's always a different process that goes on to create these natural patterns. And then you can take that pattern and replicate it in a residential garden. This is a garden in central Texas, totally planted. But let me back up, and you can see here's that naturalistic drift pattern of agave as they grow in nature. And if you want to make a garden of native plants and you really want it to look like nature, then you can just imitate these patterns that you see in the wild. The trees that you see on the left are planted, the agaves are planted, all in a naturalistic drift pattern. And back at the Santa Fe Botanical Garden, around this little detention pond that we designed, we put in this naturalistic drift of cedars. At Frederick Law Olmsted's retirement home on Deer Isle in Maine, this drift of pine trees. And I guess the point of this image is to say that if you use a strong architectural form of some kind in juxtaposition with one of these natural patterns, one of these organic forms, it really accentuates the beauty, I think, of the naturalistic drift. So I'm not saying that you should just avoid architectural lines, but I think the thing to do is intentionally play architectural lines against these natural patterns to create some real strong beauty and interest. At Isabella Isabel Green's design for the Silver Garden, another conservatory garden at Longwood in Pennsylvania, using the naturalistic drift of plants that she selected mostly with a silver sort of color to create this very natural beauty. And at the Chanticleer Garden in Pennsylvania, using a naturalistic drift of bluestone pavers, drifting into an asphalt walkway. And that's a really good technique for integrating two different paving materials where one meets another. Why not just use one of these patterns from nature to blend the materials together? The serpentine pattern, Hogarth's curving line of nature. This is at the Huntington Botanical Garden in San Marino, California. Painters have used this for centuries, the serpentine line. Your eye follows the edges of things. So if you put a clean serpentine line into the landscape, the viewer's eye will travel along that serpentine edge. And if you reward it with a focal point at the end, you've got a really strong classical sort of artistic composition. And at the Bloedel Reserve on Bainbridge Island outside of Seattle, this beautiful serpentine line separating a wildflower meadow from a lawn. Now, and this is in the middle of the winter, so in the wintertime, a wildflower meadow maybe isn't that beautiful, but it's there and you can see it. And so if you make a really strong serpentine edge between meadow and lawn, it brings some sort of abstract artistry and some interest into the winter landscape. The serpent, of course, is the genesis of the serpentine line. This was a black snake on my driveway when I lived in Landenberg, Pennsylvania. And I love the way these patterns show up in different scales and different media. This was flying over, some piece of the Mississippi, somewhere in the more southern part of the Mississippi basin, I guess. But what I love is the similarity between this kind of serpentine line and the snake from the previous image. Of course, the process here is the process of erosion and deposition. As the river snakes its way through the landscape, on the outside of the curve, the water's moving faster and scouring away the soil. On the inside of the curve, it has fewer linear feet to travel, so the water's moving a little more slowly, and that's where the sediments are dropped out. And so over time, scouring the outside edge, depositing sediments on the inside edge of these curves, the serpentine pattern gets more and more distinct over the centuries. But what I love is not only are these two patterns similar, but they're almost identical. So it's great to see at the very small scale and at the very large scale these patterns repeating themselves in nature. A private residence that I've been working on for a number of years in Middleburg, Virginia. When I first was brought down to Wayne and Beth's place in Middleburg, they had put these pasture fences up, and I was delighted to see that they put the fences not in rectangles. They don't have rectangular pastures, but they put the fences in these very subtle serpentine lines because they wanted to accentuate or sort of go along with these subtle serpentine lines in the native landforms. So we've had a lot of fun playing with the serpentine line. I'll go down there and put some flags in the ground, and Wayne will come along I called it a lawnmower once, and Wayne corrected me that it's actually a lawn tractor. So he's from Texas. I'll put the flags in the ground, and then Wayne will paint the lines using the lawnmower or the lawn tractor as a paintbrush. And then we just let those pasture grasses grow up and make a walkway. They call this walkway the daily jaunt. It's a daily walk that they take around the perimeter of their property. And, of course, this is really fun because you can mow the pasture down at the end of the year and then next year move the curving walkway into a different shape, using that curving line to draw the eye through the landscape, the edge here between pasture and lawn, pulling your eye through the landscape down to a grove of trees that we put in next to the pond. And as you go down that curving line, you find that you're in a circle of trees and a council ring and just a pleasant place to sit. was an article about this project in the New York Times. It was just before Christmas, just last fall. And so in preparation for that, for the author coming down, that was Ann Raver who wrote that article. She's a wonderful writer. I spent the weekend with Wayne and Beth and some of their friends making this serpentine line. There's bundles of grasses all stitched together into a big long rope, making a serpentine line going through the landscape and down to that circle of oak trees. That idea sort of came from a project that I was working on a number of years ago at the New England Wildflower Society at the Garden in the Woods. Gwen Stauffer was the director there at the time, and Gwen came up with this idea. Of course, that's a native plant garden, the Garden in the Woods, and she wanted to shake things up a little bit. New Englanders are very sort of conventional about how you use native plants, and she brought me up to do a whole series of abstract art installations using native plants and things that came from native plants to create works of abstract design, showing different ways that you can use native plants in the landscape. So Gwen actually had this idea of doing something similar to the work of sculptor Andy Goldsworthy, where we made this big serpentine line going through the woods. So all we did was we took all those fallen trees that were in this little valley and just rearranged them. I worked for a day with a group of 3 staff and 3 volunteers, picking up those branches and moving them around. And after really just an afternoon of work, we had this serpentine line going through this valley. This was a temporary exhibition. It was only supposed to be up for one summer, but this was pretty popular with the public. So they decided to leave it in place, and so it went into the winter. And they've been sending me slides of this. I'm glad they decided to keep it as a permanent project. I didn't really want to go in there and scatter everything back around again. But it's been 5 or 6 years now that this has been in place, and other branches have fallen around it. It's starting to rot and meld down into the soil. So it's sort of this long-term process of erosion and decay where it's gradually returning back to the simple forest floor. They have a new director of horticulture, Mark Richardson, and last winter opened up my email one day and saw this photograph from Mark. So they're continuing to play with this sculpture in the landscape. This is just Christmas lights strewn along the serpentine line of tree trunks. After a lecture once showing these images, one of the people in the audience sent me this email. This is a gardener outside of Wilmington, Delaware, that after the lecture went home and with his family over a weekend, rearranged the fallen branches in the woods out behind his house, and then sent me this image. And this is, I think, really delightful. I mean, when you can do something in the landscape in a public garden and then a visitor gets inspired by that and takes the idea home and replicates it in their own garden, to me, that's what a public garden is all about. That's what lecturing in these public venues is all about, to get people to experiment with these shapes and forms in their own garden at home. Back at the Huntington Botanical Garden, the use of the serpentine pathway to pull your eye through the landscape. And here is a good example of 2 different patterns being superimposed on top of each other. The serpentine line of the walkway and then the naturalistic drift in these golden barrel cactus. And that's a really simple thing to do. We're talking about 8 patterns today. So, I encourage you just to pick any 2 of them and superimpose them in a design, in a garden, in a landscape. Your eye likes to pick up information and feed it to your brain. Your brain is an information processing organism. And it can get bored. So if it's just a simple serpentine line, that's really not feeding it enough. So if you combine a serpentine line with another pattern, add a little bit of richness, it creates a lot more interest and holds your attention a little longer. I find if you put 3, 4 patterns in one scene, it can get kind of complex and a little confusing. So try that as an experiment. Take any 2 of these patterns and combine them in a design. The spiral. There's probably more examples of a spiral pattern in nature and certainly in art than almost any other pattern. Here's the chambered nautilus. a spiral staircase. This is at Vizcaya in Florida. Spiral staircase is an efficient way of getting from one level to another with using a minimum number of square feet in the plan view. The spiral aloe, you see spiraling in a lot of plants in nature. Here in a detention pond by Christy Ten Eyck at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix, using the spiral of this stone wall to pull the water spiraling into the landscape and down into the groundwater beneath. And she's got this in combination with the naturalistic drift of native Sporobolus, those clumps of grasses drifting across the simple spiral. This, by the way, is not there anymore. This was planted or built a number of years ago, and as happens in botanical gardens, they've replaced it with a different garden. I was glad I was there to experience this and get these photographs of it. We're moving up in scale now from the small shell of the spiral nautilus up to the large-scale environmental earthwork. This is Spiral Jetty, kind of one of the benchmark pieces of American land art by sculptor Robert Smithson. Salt drying flats in the American Southwest. I don't know why the spiral form was used here. If anybody has any ideas on that, I'd be happy to hear about it. But it's a beautiful spiral pattern at a large scale. And weather moves across the Earth in spiraling patterns. So we're getting larger and larger in scale all the way out to the scale of the universe. This is the spiral nebula. I was at a lighting manufacturing plant in Iowa, and by the assembly line, and they were making these giant lights, these lamps for stadium lighting. And standing there at the assembly line saw these pieces of lamp kind of arrayed in this spiraling pattern, and I asked the person working the line there what, where the spiral idea came from, and she said, well, it's an efficient way to lay the maximum number of pieces on the table, but lay them out in such a way that they're easy to pick up and put onto the light fixture as it moves down the belt. Alfred Hitchcock used the spiral a lot in his movies to indicate disorientation, and you start to see that over and over again in his work. And on the right, I was at a convenience store in Pennsylvania, at a Wawa convenience store, filling the car with gas, and on top of the gas pump was this advertisement trying to get me to go into the store and buy iced tea or fruit drinks. So they're using this hypnotic idea, you're getting thirsty, and using the spiral to talk about that sort of hypnosis. A lot of plants have some sort of spiraling form. These are native Texas plants, Spiranthes, the bishop's cap, spiral bean mesquite. I've been working for a number of years on various projects at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin. We're just completing building their new children's garden. And they wanted to have in that garden a collection of plants, of native plants that have spiraling form. And I thought that's a difficult collection to make a garden out of. It's a lot of different kinds of plants, and there's not a lot of unity in there. So I came up with the idea of doing this big spiraling wall to sort of enclose this whole collection. And then on the wall, a number of different tile mosaic images with different sorts of spirals going on in them. I worked with my studio assistant, Kit Howland, in creating a sequence of mosaic tile images, distilling these images down from the spiraling patterns in nature in order to come up with a sort of family of shapes and ideas to put onto the mosaic wall. And just about a month ago, I spent a couple of weeks at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center working with a bunch of tile masons creating these tile mosaics on the walls. The radial pattern. You'll see this a lot in nature. It's one of the ways that plants organize themselves. It's one of the ways that materials move through a plant. It's how you get water from a central source at the base of the plant, moving out through the leaves, and then how photosynthesis happens along the leaves, and the materials of produced from photosynthesis are brought down into the center of the plant and feed the roots down in the soil. A lot of flowers, as in this allium, use the radial pattern, spokes radiating out from a central hub. So a lot of structural engineering that goes on using the radial pattern as well. And it shows up in a lot of art and culture. On the upper left is the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Utah. So the source, the spirit source is at the center of the wheel. And the medicine people would dance around the outer edge of the wheel, symbolizing that the spirit energy comes out from the center, pulled out to the perimeter, so that the medicine people can then take that energy and transport it to the people. The lower left are some Aboriginal dot paintings from Australia. These concentric circles radiating from a central point are symbolic of watering holes in the landscape. And on the right, a sculptural installation by my friend Dominique Mezode, who is a sculptor who lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Dominique does this sort of ritual walk in the Rio Grande every morning, and she started noticing these little Y-shaped sticks that were washed down the creek, and started collecting them. And she kind of visualized these as a human form with its arms reaching up to the heavens. And so she's been arranging these on the walls of galleries and in museums, again, symbolizing some sort of spirit energy coming from a center point and radiating outward. So these are really profound cultural patterns that we can use in our work as garden designers. At Kykuit, the Rockefeller Estate on the Hudson outside of New York, these radiating concentric circles of pebbles just to create an interesting paving design. And, of course, each of these circles then is arranged in a scattered pattern, clumps and gaps. When I lived in Austin, Texas, I had this little radial fire circle in my front garden, just radiating stones coming out from the center. And then I, one day, just as a way of doodling with sticks, made this little wreath of sticks radiating out from a central point. Medieval farm fields in the south of France. These medieval fields, this is around the time of the invention of the deep plow. So there'd be 4, 6, 8 oxen pulling one of these big steel blades through heavy soil. And a long team of oxen like that takes a lot of space to turn around. So they made these very long, narrow fields so that they had the maximum amount of space for growing food and a minimum amount of space for turning around the rig at the end of the field. And in this case, the fields were planted in this radial pattern coming out from the circle where the village may have been, but in this particular slide is no more. There's always a process that leads to these patterns when you see them in nature or in the cultural landscape. Dendritic. There are two ways that plants organize themselves, the radial pattern and the dendritic pattern, branching and branching and branching again to take the water from and the nutrients from the ground, distribute it out to the leaves at the outer edge of the tree, where the leaves are harvesting sunlight, doing photosynthesis, creating food, bringing it back down, branching down, down, and down, and into the soil. And just the abstract beauty of some of these dendritic patterns. Sumac growing at Tyler Arboretum in Chester County, Pennsylvania. I was flying over western Pennsylvania once early in the morning and looked down, and this was fog kind of nestled down in the valleys of some sort of river system. And, of course, river systems move through the landscape in this dendritic pattern. Ice crystals growing across the surface of a window, branching and branching. The Wax Lake Delta in the Gulf of Mexico This is a relatively new delta. The Black's Lake was drained by the Army Corps of Engineers, I think in the 1950s, and they dug a canal out to the Gulf, and all the waters of the lake drained out into the Gulf, and the sediments fanned out and made this delta in this perfect dendritic pattern. So this is a relatively new delta, new river delta. It hasn't had hundreds of hurricanes disturbing it, so the dendritic pattern is still pretty clean and pretty visible. Notice also in the lower part of this slide the serpentine pattern of the rivulets going along the edge of the Gulf. Back to Wayne and Beth's place in Middleburg, Virginia, this hedgerow of sassafras trees, beautiful sort of scrim of dendritic patterns against the sky. There are so many stories and artworks throughout human history that connect humans with trees at an almost sort of spiritual level. And I kind of have come to believe that I think one of the reasons that there's such a strong identity between humans and trees is that we share that dendritic pattern. I mean, our own system in our body, our nervous system, our circulatory system, the materials move through our body in a dendritic pattern the way they do in the trees. And we can take that in fine horticulture, take that dendritic pattern and abstract it and work with it to make it even more clean, make it even more abstract as an artwork. So there's only 8 patterns. That's the good news. It's a pretty simple universe out there. The scattered, the fractured, the mosaic, the naturalistic drift, serpentine, spiral, radial, and dendritic. And so I really encourage you to just think about these very simple patterns. That idea of taking any 2 patterns and superimposing them on top of each other to create a design that has simplicity but also has a level of interest that can really hold your attention. I found this quotation just a couple of years ago. What if it was true that nature speaks in signs and that the secret to understanding its language consists in noticing similarities in shape or form? So here's a writer, Jeremy Narby, talking about his observations of nature. Really, that it's a pretty simple language of shapes and forms. People often ask, have I studied fractal geometry? This is sort of science and math looking at patterns in nature. And yeah, I'm interested in fractal geometry. It's a different way of looking at nature patterns. For me, as an artist, I have a more sort of intuitive or direct visual way of looking at these patterns. I love this definition of a fractal that's toward the lower right of the slide. A fractal is a mathematical set that has a fractal dimension that usually exceeds its topological dimension and may fall between the integers. That means absolutely nothing to me. And because I'm sure it's beauty for a mathematician, but it's not the way I've been harvesting images from nature. That mathematical equation running along the bottom of the screen there is a rather profound and beautiful string of symbols. And it is a mathematical equation that talks about a particular fractal pattern. Again, it's not meaningful to me. I actually have had mathematicians after a lecture come up to me and say, you ought to study math because it's like art and it is beautiful. And yes, it is. And study fractal geometry. I think you'll find a lot of interesting patterns to use in your work. I do a lot of workshops with design students, with APLD members, and looking at these patterns in nature and using drawing as a way of abstracting them. Put up an image of a serpentine river, and on the upper left, make a quick sketch of that, and then do it again, and on the lower left, again, and then a 4th time. And sort of like Roberto Burle Marx working with Conrad Hammerman, do it again and again and again, and eventually evolving a language of shapes and forms that you can use in landscape design. And using simple kindergarten-level materials here with undergraduates at the University of Delaware, taking a glue stick and 5 pieces of construction paper and abstracting the pattern that's in a natural meadow. And in a workshop with APLD members and at Red Butte Botanical Garden, going out into the landscape and using just 4 or 5 colors of pastel, recreating the patterns that you see in nature, making a blanket, a patchwork of these, laying down tracing paper on top and developing a vocabulary of curving lines, and then taking that vocabulary of line and developing a sequence of alternative designs for a garden. I do a lot of doodling. I spend a lot of time on airplanes playing with patterns and seeing where that can take me. I mean, here playing with serpentine patterns. And it's a way of connecting to other artists as well. A friend of mine sent me the work of an artist on the beaches of California. And hang on to that thought. I'll show you that in a minute. Here is, this evolved in an airport. And sometimes these patterns kind of evolve in a way that's surprising to you. This one began by a simple square. Look at the whole pattern. It's just made up of squares. And let me show that in a little more detail. I started with just a square on a page and said, what happens if I draw another square and rotate it, and another square, and do it again and again and again? And this spiral pattern began to evolve. And then what happens if I do another one next to it? Well, that fan shape occurred, and then another one. And these interesting patterns all started to fill the page. So this wasn't premeditated. It's just kind of happened. And so doing this doodling and playing with patterns can really take you some interesting places. Here's that beach artist in California. And totally independently, through his work on the beach, doing a doodle that's similar to what I was doing in the sketchbook. And it always feels good to have that connection with other artists. I don't recall how this image evolved, but it was playing with these curving lines and then hiking in Maine and finding this fungus growing on a tree. Same pattern. And then at a formal garden in France, another similar pattern. And then putting a lecture together and going, wow, actually these images are all sort of connected. And not only are we looking at similar form, similar line, but a similar palette of colors. And that's all happening in an unpremeditated kind of way. It's just a way to immerse yourself in art and design. Just see where it takes you. My hair kind of starts to tingle when I see these congruent sort of things happening. And it really does feel like, when I see another artist working with similar shapes and forms, I don't feel like, oh, darn, somebody else is doing that. I feel like this is great. We're connected through this basic vocabulary of shapes and nature. And using that in some of my work here at Pierce's Woods in Longwood, a native plant garden, where they really wanted to use native plants, but use it in bold and powerful, abstract kind of forms. So making these curving lines of Tiarella moving through against a big solid mass of native Pachysandra. And this mosaic of woodland phlox with Tiarella. They had a walkway where we wanted to use a variety of flowering native azaleas, flame azaleas, which are fragrant, which is nice. So we developed this design of clusters of native trees with sort of clouds of azaleas going down the pathway. I had 2 springs to observe these azaleas in the nursery at Longwood and very carefully select what colors would go where. The native Florida flame azalea has a natural range of flower color from pale yellow to deep orange. And so visiting these plants in bloom through 2 successive springs, tagging them, making notes about them, putting out the flags in the landscape, and laying them out so there's this progression of color from pale yellow at one end to deep orange at another in this organic pattern. And, of course, these are fragrant, so these people are walking through clouds of fragrance. And using sketching not as a way of making illustrative drawings or drawings to share with a class, certainly not to hang on a wall in a gallery. This isn't that kind of art. but this is just simple little doodles in your sketchbook to record ideas that you're seeing in on a site, and to abstract the patterns that might be present that you can work with as a designer. Making a drawing, this is what became known as the cathedral clearing in the middle of Pierce's Woods at Longwood. So on top, making the first drawing that kind of records everything I saw, and then on the left, making a second drawing that's abstracting that more, and then on the right, even more abstract, just to start to develop a very simplified vocabulary of form to use in the design. And making very small these are color sketches with oil pastel, and they're only about 2.5 inches high by 3 or 4 inches wide, just recording ideas. And they're kind of a mess, and you can see I'll go back into the field later and make additional notes, and it's all about just recording ideas. This is notes taken for myself. This is not even to share with others. It's just a way of recording things that you see through in the landscape. On one edge of Pierce's Wood, there was a sunny, moist edge. We put this dense planting of taxodium, of bald cypress, and really pushing the trunks up together to create these clumps and gaps, and then seeing as they grew these wonderful patterns evolving of these vertical lines of the skinny tree trunks, and then seeing it in the fall. And over the years, after about 10 or 15 years of time, I started working on this project in 1992, and I still visit Longwood and work with them once a year to help evolve the design. So this was about 10 years into the growth of these taxodiums, and then years ago, visiting there in August, and these lobelia had decided that they really wanted to live there, and so they just let them go and create this strong blue carpet. These vertical stems of lobelia complementing the vertical stems of the taxodium. And doing small sketches. This is for the Southern Highlands Reserve in North Carolina, and these are just 2-inch squares. So take a notebook with you, a sketch pad, and what I would do is just draw very faintly a 2-inch grid, and then just walk through the landscape, and whatever catches your eye, make a little drawing. Now, a 2-inch drawing is so small you can't put a lot of information on a 2-inch square, so you're almost forced to think abstractly. So this is just walking through the landscape and making a note about whatever attracts my eye. And then a different kind of exercise. Here's the same idea, taking those small squares, and in this case, walking 50 feet and stopping and drawing what's in front of you, and then walking another 50 feet, stopping and drawing what's in front of you. This way, the site is kind of speaking to you. You're not really picking out things, and you notice different kinds of things with this exercise than with the other one. Also, write a couple of words, just a few words that distill what it is you're looking at. You know, this is a steep slope. These are high banks. Here the sky is visible. Here the sky is not visible. Here's a stump that's a focal point. So just a very simple abstract drawing and just a few simple words to describe what you're seeing, and then you can create a design that is a distillation of these natural patterns that is on the site. These were native clumps of flame azalea. This is in a natural woods in the mountains of western North Carolina. And drawing these serpentine lines to connect one clump to the next, simple mulched pathway, taking the existing ground layer of native shrubs or native ferns and other things, and just simplifying that, unifying it into one simple sweep of lady fern. Using a serpentine line to separate a native woodland from a lawn that was going to be a gathering place. And here, an entirely made-up composition, an entrance to the woods, making a foyer around a clump of red maple stems, bringing these giant slabs of granite up from the bottom of the mountain and laying in these steps and making a room out of these flowering rhododendrons. They wanted to have a maze, and they did have one. This is a woodland garden, but they did have one place of open sun. So using the classical labyrinth, concentric rings, of pathways leading to a circular bench in the center, place to sit and meditate. And the pathway is almost like a metaphor for the journey of life. In some places you're walking along the path and the wildflowers are down around your knees and the walking is pretty easy. And in other places the native grasses are pressing up against you and you're kind of having to push your way through. Sort of like it is in life. Sometimes the walking's pretty easy and in other times it's a little tougher. And then finally you get to the view across the distant mountains in western North Carolina. So I'm going to leave you with that image, and I hope you've seen some ways of using these abstract patterns in garden design. I hope you've got a sense of how simple a vocabulary you can develop when you're studying patterns in nature. And take that idea of using two patterns, pick any two, and superimpose them when you're developing a design and see what kind of interest you can create. Jen, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Yes, it is 3 o'clock. If we want to take maybe one or two questions, I will turn the control of the question and answer to John from TBG Webinar.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Okay, we're going to open up the floor for questions. Give me 1 minute here. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please press 01 on your touch-tone phone, and you'll be added to the question queue. Again, to ask a question or make a comment, please press 01 on your touch-tone phone. We'll give it a moment here and see what the questions gather. Okay, we do have a question for Gary. Caller from the 408 area code, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I wondered if Gary could talk a little bit about sort of incorporating color and texture within two patterns, like maybe within this idea of layering two patterns on top of each other. The color and texture of the actual plant seems to be sort of secondary, tertiary stuff along the way, but how that starts working into the patterns as well.
Well, that's a really good question. And one of the things I love about designing with plants is the layers of interest that we can bring into the composition. And I think it's one reason that it's really good to think about these real basic and simple patterns as an overall structuring of the garden, because then once you have that strong, simple structure down, then you can start to embroider it with all kinds of color and texture. And I really recommend using bold, large shapes. And let's go to that image in the beginning from Roberto Burle Marx. So these are really strong shapes in the landscape. And look at some of the contrast in texture that's going on, these big billowing masses of grass as focal points. And then the work of A.E. Bide, very, very subtle changes of texture, but still a fairly simple palette of plants. So what I suggest doing is thinking of a design that's pretty strong, pretty simple, just a few different forms or shapes or patterns, and then start to use color and texture as a way of embroidering. So a big band of coarse texture against a big band of fine texture, and then little spots of color here and there crossing the line, separating that big texture from the fine texture. It really is the way a painter creates a painting. Start with some bold strokes and then articulate it with little bits of color and texture here and there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I really love that if you have the strong structure to begin with, then it gives you a lot of license to make all kinds of really interesting choices. But if it's just all about as many different colors and textures as you can cook up from the beginning, it can get pretty confusing pretty quickly.
Yeah. Thank you.
What else?
Again, as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please press 01 to be added to the question queue. Okay, it looks like we have another question coming in here, Gary. Caller from the 631 area code, please go ahead with your question.
if you have ever used music in the landscape, or used music as an inspiration for the landscape, or leitmotifs in the landscape.
What a wonderful question. And there's another lecture there altogether. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of seeing Daryl Morrison.
Oh, yes.
One of his demonstrations of Daryl and I have collaborated in design workshops before, where he'll put on the music and start to almost dance around the drawing. And I really think music is a great source of inspiration for us as designers. I've enjoyed collaborating with many different kinds of artists: painters, storytellers, dancers, musicians. Each different kind of artist has a sort of different vocabulary that they work with, and it's always fun to combine those with our vocabulary as garden designers. The Music Garden in Toronto by Julie Meservey is often talked about when we talk about music and design. And there, she collaborated with the cellist Yo-Yo Ma. And in that case, it's a fairly literal translation of a sonata and its different movements into a garden. So that's one way of doing it, to take something in music and actually think of shapes and forms and places and rhythms that imitate that music and put that into the garden. That's one way of connecting music and design. But another is as Daryl does, as Daryl Morrison does, put on the music and let that inspire you, and let that sort of that meter, that rhythm, determine how your hand moves across the page, and just let yourself go and see what kinds of shapes and forms evolve. So yeah, I think that's a great topic, and let's think of doing a whole session at an APLD meeting about that. How to use music, either literally in how you structure a garden design, or just as a source of inspiration to get you motivated as a designer. Have you had an opportunity to see Daryl Morrison demonstrate that? Have you used music in your own work?
Yes, I went to Columbia University's landscape design program, and I had him as an instructor, and so I was involved in that with him in his course that I took with him.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. As I said, that's another topic entirely, the idea of collaborating with artists and crossing over different artist disciplines as a way of enriching your work as a designer.
Thank you.
Gary, I'm not showing any other questions in queue, but again, as a quick reminder, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please press 01 on your touch-tone phone. We'll give it a moment here, Gary. I have another question coming in, it looks like. Give me one moment. Caller, please go ahead with your question from the 408 area code.
Hi, thank you. Gary, I wondered if you could talk about sort of initial, you sort of did did a lot with the talk about walking 50 feet, making a record, and, letting your site speak to you, but maybe more on a residential scale. Where do you sort of begin if you're looking for two patterns, and, when you're talking about initial concept creation, is it completely arbitrary, or how do you kind of look on a smaller scale for those places where to start?
Good, and thank you for that. And there are, I think different techniques for working at different scales, and certain techniques are more suited to one scale than they might be to another. Mm-hmm. In that sequential drawing exercise, I had 10 acres of woodlands to walk through. So that was a wonderful luxury, and that particular technique was useful for that garden. In an eighth of an acre lot, that's not going to be a useful technique. But still, I encourage everyone to use drawing as a way of recording patterns, and remember that if you're drawing not as something to share with others, not as something to put up on the wall, but just as something to aid your own memory, so it's your own note-taking, what that does is it starts to really build a strong vocabulary in yourself that you can use on a garden at any scale. Oh, and by the way, the other thing that happens is if you really forget about whether you're good at drawing or not and just consider making these little notes as it's really just a note-taking exercise, what you will find pretty quickly is you're ending up making drawings that you really want to share with other people. And if you have a catalog of these sketches that illustrate these different patterns and forms, you can share those with a client, and they'll see that you're an artistic genius, and they too will be inspired by the observations that you've made out in the 10-acre woods somewhere else, and it'll really help you work with them to generate ideas. Sometimes in the small, you're doing a roof deck, and it's a rectangle, and so you're really bringing your own ideas in entirely. And that's where you have to sort of draw on your inner well of experience and shapes and all that. And so if you found that you're really getting a lot of pleasure from working with serpentine lines and the naturalistic drift superimposed over that, then just set that for yourself as a design exercise and see where it takes you. Then set that aside and say, well, I'm going to do something a little different. How about if I set up an architectural grid, and now let's see how the dendritic pattern might interact with that. And you lay that pattern down over top of it and literally look to see what kinds of shapes evolve, much the way that illustration I was showing of Conrad Hammerman making those abstract paintings and then generating a sequence of triangles and trapezoids and so on to use in his own garden. When you have a blank slate and you're working on a small site, there are so many possibilities that sometimes you sort of don't know where to begin. And I think sometimes almost arbitrarily just saying, okay, right now for this exercise, I'm just going to choose my two favorite patterns and I'm going to lay them on top of each other and I'm going to see where that takes me. It's a simple exercise to do for yourself that limits your choices and helps you make decisions and lead to some really interesting combinations of shapes and patterns that you might not have thought of if you hadn't just started this process going and seeing where it takes you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for that question. That's a good one.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Gary, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our attendees. We appreciate you taking the time.
It's a pleasure, Jen. Thank you very much.
And for our attendees, please note that within the next 7 to 10 days, you will receive an email with a link and instructions on how to download a copy of the webinar from today. Please make sure to check your spam folder as our emails can sometimes end up there. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.